Okay, well, what have we gone through so far? Well, we did the first two meditations. And really what Descartes is doing is he's setting up his inquiry. He's outlining the kinds of questions that he's thinking about. And as we said last week, what Descartes is doing here represents in some part a radical break from the philosophy of his time and the philosophy that dominated the centuries before this period in European history. Okay? I talked to you about empirical Aristotelian scholasticism. You can call this Thomism. Thomism, developed by Thomas Aquinas many centuries ago, became basically the founding philosophy for the Catholic Church. Now, Descartes is also Catholic, or at least he was raised Catholic, but he disagrees with some of the fundamental presuppositions of this kind of philosophy, which says that we learn about the world through our senses, through experience, and insofar as it is associated with the church, that we should rely on supernatural explanations and church authority and church tradition in order to understand the world and what's going on. Descartes says no to that. Okay? The Fifth Lateran Council of the Catholic Church, which I believe was in 1513, put forth a mandate or edict which said all good Catholic believers should be able to, on the basis of just natural reason, be able to defend the immortality and the existence of the soul. So in part, Descartes is kind of responding to that edict. He's like, okay, I will develop an argument for the existence and immortality of the soul that doesn't rely on supernatural explanation. So that's part of what he's doing in the Meditations. But what else he is doing is he's trying to convert people to his way of thinking. Descartes was educated by Catholics. He was educated by the Jesuits, and so he swam in this philosophy. But he disagrees with it. Again, this Thomistic scholasticism. But what has he done so far in the Meditations? Well, he's done a few things, right? Through the wax example, he tried to demonstrate that it isn't through our senses, through experience that we come to understand the world, but it is through our minds, right? Through reasoning and thinking and analyzing. What else is he doing in the Meditations, and what has he done so far? Well, he's trying to establish that there is a radical distinction between the mind and the body, right? That's another thing that he's focusing in on here, and that he's trying to defend, he's trying to support. So what or who we are is fundamentally a thinking thing. Thought and everything that goes along with thought is not something that is separable from our existence. Whereas we can imagine ourselves without a body, we can imagine ourselves without limbs, we can imagine ourselves without these other physical things. He discovered, just through reason, the natural light of reason, thinking about this stuff, that as long as he is thinking, he can know that he exists. Even if there is an evil demon who's all-powerful, whose sole purpose is trying to deceive him. Right? So he established the existence, he thinks, of the self. We can know with certainty that the self exists, that the mind exists, that we exist when we're thinking and doing mental stuff. Okay? Now what's going to matter going forward for him is clear and distinct perceptions. He's going to say, if I have a clear and distinct perception about something, that is the door through which I can know it. Okay? It's not through the senses, not through the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, whatever. Clear and distinct perceptions. However, if you've been paying attention to the meditations, there's still something Descartes has not figured out. There's something he still has not dealt with. And what is that? Well, what about this evil demon or genius thing? Has he shown that such a thing does not exist? No, on the contrary. He's going to say in the opening pages of this third meditation that if such a being does exist, that undermines basically the possibility of all other knowledge. We can know that we exist, but if such a thing did exist, how could we know anything else? How could we know what the external world is like? How could we know we're awake or asleep or not right now? How could we know that we have a body? So he still has to deal with this. And part of what he's going to do in these meditations that we're looking at this week is he's going to try to wrestle with that. He's going to try to show that, no, it's okay, this thing doesn't exist. I can actually come to knowledge of things. There are things that I can know. And as we'll see, he's going to end up providing arguments not only for the existence of the external world, that there is a world outside our own minds, but also he's going to come back to the beliefs that he once formerly held, and he's going to try to argue for and justify those. That he is a body, that the senses are actually pretty reliable, but he hasn't done that yet. That's work that still has to be done. So, because the existence of such a being would undermine basically any other piece of knowledge, he still has to explore and wrestle with it. He talks about this in the opening pages of the Meditation 3. Now, I will just read this. I'm not going to worry about bringing that down right now because I still have a lot to get through here. But he says right at the beginning, I shall now close my eyes, I shall stop my ears, I shall call away all my senses. I shall efface, even from my thoughts, all the images of corporeal things. Or at least, for that is hardly possible, I shall esteem them as vain and false. And thus holding converse only with myself, and considering my own nature, I shall try little by little to reach a better knowledge of and a more familiar acquaintanceship with myself. I am a thing that thinks, that is to say, that doubts, affirms, denies, that knows a few things, that is ignorant of many, that loves, that hates, that wills, that desires, that also imagines and perceives. For as I remarked before, although the things which I perceive and imagine are perhaps nothing at all apart from me in themselves, that is, even though I imagine and perceive things, that doesn't necessarily mean there are things outside of my own mind that are giving me these ideas. I am nevertheless assured that these modes of thought that I call perceptions and imaginations, inasmuch only as they are modes of thought, certainly reside and are met with in me. He's having perceptions, right? The existence of those things are real. And then in the little that I have just said, I think I have summed up all that I really know, or at least all that hitherto I was aware that I knew. In order to extend my knowledge further then, I shall look around more carefully and see whether I cannot still discover in myself some other things which I have not hitherto perceived. I am certain that I am a thing which thinks, but do I not then likewise know what is required to render me certain of a truth? Certainly in this first knowledge there is nothing that assures me of its truth, except the clear and distinct perception of that which I state, which would not indeed suffice to assure me that what I say is true if it could ever happen that a thing which I conceived so clearly and distinctly could be false. And accordingly, it seems to me that already I can establish a general rule that all things which I perceive very clearly and very distinctly are true. Skipping ahead, on the other hand, always when I direct my attention to things which I believe myself to perceive very clearly, I am so persuaded of their truth that I let myself break out into words such as these. Let who will deceive me? He can never cause me to be nothing while I think that I am. Or someday cause it to be true to say that I have never been. It being true now to say that I am, or that 2 and 3 make more or less than 5, or any such thing in which I see a manifest contradiction. And certainly, since I have no reason to believe that there is a God who is a deceiver, and as I have not yet satisfied myself that there is a God at all, the reason for doubt, which depends on this opinion alone, is very slight, and so to speak, metaphysical. But in order to be able altogether to remove it, I must inquire whether there is a God as soon as the occasion presents itself. And if I find that there is a God, I must also inquire whether he may be a deceiver. For without a knowledge of these two truths, I do not see that I can ever be certain of anything. So, what is he doing in this meditation? Well, he's going to investigate this. Is there a deceiver? Is there a God? What is this thing like? Because if it turns out that there is something like a God who's trying to deceive all of us, well, then what can we actually know at the end of the day? We'd be powerless in the face of such a thing, right? Okay. Now, Descartes does go on to provide a proof for the existence of God in this meditation. However, in order to understand his proof, there are a few distinctions that we have to get on the table. Because he uses some of these terms technically as terms of art. They have specific meanings, specific definitions. It probably made this meditation a little difficult for you, not knowing what these are. First, we'll put one distinction on the table between substance and mode. Okay, these are terms that are going to pop up in this meditation, and they mean specific things. What is a substance? Well, think of it like this. It's something which exists that has properties and which requires nothing else to exist. Think of a substance like an object. A table is a substance according to Descartes. A water bottle is. A marker, right? A substance is something that has its own independent existence. So, things like tables, chairs, these would be substances. Cats, balls, minds. Does your mind depend on my mind for its existence? No, your mind has its own existence, right? Skateboards, sheets of paper, okay? These are examples of substances. We have to contrast this with mode. A mode, we could say, is a contingent property of something. For example, things like roundness, furriness, ideas would be modes. Unlike substances, which have their own independent existence, modes do not have an independent existence. Their existence depends on the existence of something else. If you're talking about the roundness of those skateboard wheels, roundness would not exist unless the wheels existed. If you're talking about the furriness of your cat, that furriness would not exist if your cat didn't exist. If you're talking about the smoothness of the desk table, that smoothness would not exist unless the desk existed. So modes, their existence requires something else. Their existence is parasitic on something else. If that something else does not exist, they do not exist. And ideas are modes as well. Why? Well, ideas don't just exist out there in the world. Ideas depend on minds for their existence, right? There wouldn't be any ideas in your head if you didn't have a mind, right? So, this is the first distinction we need to get on the table. It's going to be important for Descartes' proof of the existence of God. But there's another one as well. Actually, I'm going to move it over here a little bit. That is between formal reality and objective reality. The formal reality of a thing is the reality that something has in virtue of it being a thing. Descartes is making this distinction between formal and objective reality because he wants to draw out the difference between the kind of existence that a mind has, or rather, the kind of existence a mind has and the kind of existence that an idea has. The kind of reality, for example, that this desk has, it's a different level of reality compared to an idea. And you already kind of believe this, right? Are your ideas as real as the desk in front of you? What do you think? Yeah.
They're probably just as real because you're constantly thinking of these ideas, and if you act on them, then they come into reality. So until then, they're not really there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they exist, right? You're having ideas, you're having perceptions. But again, those things wouldn't exist without your mind, right? Whereas your mind doesn't need to have ideas in order to exist, right? If you're like me, hopefully, sometimes you can just take a break from thinking. And you're happy about that. So, the formal reality of something is the reality that that thing has in virtue of it being a thing in the world. This desk has a certain formal reality to it. He contrasts this with objective reality, which is a bad word. I don't know why he used these terms, because the term is not intuitive for what it's trying to describe. The objective reality of a thing is the reality something has in virtue of it being a representation of something. Because what are your ideas, for instance? Well, they're not a thing in the world, you might say, like an eraser is. Right? If your mind went kaput, you would have no more ideas. There are no more, they're gone. Whereas if you died today, this eraser would still be here, right? So, our ideas have kind of these two peculiar qualities. They depend on our mind for their existence, but they're also about something. Our ideas are about things. In the way that a desk is not about anything. You kind of see what I'm getting at here? When you have an idea in your mind, it is a representation of something. It's a representation of a hope maybe, or a desire, or of a thing in the world, right? Imagine a table. You're picturing a table. You have an image of a table in your head. That idea is a representation of a table. Yes?
Real quick, what does it say behind the computer? I can't read that.
The reality something has in virtue of it being a representation of something. So ideas exist. The ideas you have in your minds exist. But they're different than the kinds of things that have formal reality. Okay, desks, markers, shirts, headphones, they're not about things. They're not representations of other things. Whereas our ideas that we have in our minds, they're representations of things. Descartes is what we might call a representationalist. He thinks that our ideas in our minds are stand-ins for something else. Does that make sense? So we need to distinguish then between, well, how a substance and a mode are different, and how the formal reality of a thing is different from the objective reality of a thing. These are going to be critical for his proof for the existence of God. So what is Descartes doing now? Well, I've laid out these distinctions for you. What does he do in the third meditation? Well, he realizes he has all these ideas about things, but he reflects on them and he's like, well, where do they come from? Where do my ideas come from? He considers the possibility that maybe he's just making up all of the ideas that he has. This is something that we can all do, right? You can imagine a table in your mind. Boop. There you go. You just created an idea, right? You created an image in your own mind. But that's probably not where you think most ideas come from. You have a certain idea about me. You have an idea about what USF is like, whether you like it or not. You have an idea about, how much your brother or sister likes you. You have an idea about critical thinking. Where does it seem like most of our ideas come from? It doesn't seem like we're just hallucinating or making them up. It seems like there are things out there in the world that are causing us to have ideas. This is like the common sense picture, right? You don't get the idea of what the desk is that you're sitting in because you think I'm just making it up. No, you're getting your idea of the desk by your experience with it, right? So he reflects on this. He's like, well, maybe, I have all these ideas of things. I seem to have ideas of, tables and the fireplace. Am I just making all of this up? Am I hallucinating this? Well, things get a little trickier, a little thornier, when he reflects on the idea of God. Where does this idea come from? He has this idea in his own mind of an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing, infinite thing. So Descartes reflects. He's thinking, well, did I just make that up? Did I form this idea that I have of God? Well, as we'll see, he's going to say no. He doesn't think he's just coming up with all of the ideas that he has. He talks about this on pages 15 through 17. And here is where we're going to get our proof for the existence of God. Okay? And we're going to lay this out after we read it, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to see what you all think. Okay, I'll blow it up a little bit. Okay, he says, "Now it is manifest by the natural light of reason that there must at least be as much reality in the efficient and total cause of something as in its effect. For pray, whence can the effect derive its reality, if not from its cause? And in what way can this cause communicate this reality to it, unless it possessed it in itself?" Now this is a strange idea, but he's making a claim here. Let's say there is a bonfire right in front of you, and the wood is getting hot and it's burning. And you recognize, well, the fire is causing it to get hot and burn. There's a cause and effect thing happening there, right? The fire is causing some change to the wood. If you reflect on, how hot the wood is right now, what its shape is, what's going on with the wood. What Descartes is saying here is, look, what's going on with the wood? Whatever reality the wood has, the cause of what's going on with the wood has to be at least as real as the wood. This is the kind of claim he's making. It's kind of a weird claim, but when you have a cause and an effect, the cause has to be at least as real as the effect, or more real. So this is the first premise in his argument. He says, well, let's smuggle in a kind of premise zero, that everything has a cause. Everything in reality has a cause. The cause of something must be more real, or at least as real, as the effect it produces. So, and in what way can this cause communicate the reality to its effect, unless it possessed that reality in itself? From this it follows, not only that something cannot proceed from nothing, but likewise that what is more perfect, that is to say, which has more reality within itself, cannot proceed from the less perfect. What is more real what is more perfect cannot come from the less perfect. And this is not only evidently true of those effects which possess actual or formal reality, but also of the ideas in which we consider merely what is termed objective reality. To take an example, the stone, which has not yet existed, not only cannot now commence to be, unless it has been produced by something, which possesses within it, either formally or eminently, all that enters into the composition of the stone. That is, it must possess the same things or other more excellent things than those which exist in the stone. And heat can only be produced in something in which it did not previously exist by a cause that is of an order at least as perfect as heat. And so in all other cases. But further, the idea of heat or of a stone cannot exist in me unless it had been placed within me by some cause, which possesses within it at least as much reality as that which I conceive to exist in the heat or the stone. For although this cause does not transmit anything of its actual or formal reality to my idea, we must not for that reason imagine that it is necessarily a less real cause. We must remember that since every idea is a work of the mind, its nature is such that it demands of itself no other formal reality than that which it borrows from my thought, of which it is only a mode, that is, a manner or a way of thinking. But in order that an idea should contain one certain objective reality rather than another, it must without doubt derive it from some cause in which there is at least as much formal reality as this idea contains of objective reality. For if we imagine that something is found in an idea which is not found in the cause, it must then have been derived from naught. But however imperfect may this mode of being by which a thing is objectively, or by a representation in the understanding by its an idea, we cannot certainly say that this mode of being is nothing, nor consequently that the idea derives its origin from nothing. Nor must I imagine that, since the reality that I consider in these ideas is only objective, it is not essential that this reality should be formally in the causes of my ideas, but that it is sufficient that it should be found objectively. For just as this mode of objective existence pertains to ideas by their proper nature, so does the mode of formal existence pertain to the causes of those ideas, by the nature peculiar to them. And although it may be the case that one idea gives birth to another idea, that cannot continue to be so indefinitely. For in the end, we must reach an idea whose cause shall be, so to speak, an archetype, in which the whole reality or perfection, which is, so to speak, objectively, in these ideas is contained formally and really. Thus, the light of nature causes me to know clearly that the ideas in me are like pictures or images, which can, in truth, easily fall short of the perfection of the objects from which they have been derived, but which can never contain anything greater or more perfect. And the longer and the more carefully that I investigate these matters, the more clearly and distinctly do I recognize their truth. But what am I to conclude from all of it in the end? It is this, that if the objective reality of any one of my ideas is of such a nature as clearly to make me recognize that it is not in me, either formally or eminently, and that consequently I myself cannot be the cause of it, it follows of necessity that I am not alone in the world, but that there is another being which exists, another thing which is the cause of this idea. On the other hand, had no such an idea been within me, I should have had no sufficient argument to convince me of the existence of anything beyond myself and my own mind. For I have made very careful investigation everywhere, and up to the present time have been able to find no other ground. Now, what does he go on to say? Well, after making these distinctions between substances and modes, formal reality and objective reality, what does he notice? Well, he has the idea of God within him. He's got this idea of God. Now, what typically goes along with our idea of God? Well, God is all powerful, God is all good, God is all knowing. What else is God? Well, we might say God is also infinite. Is God a finite thing like we are? Think of your idea of God. Is God something you can completely capture with your categories and words and concepts? Or does God break out of those? Is God bigger than that? Well, we might think, yeah, God is not a finite thing like we are. God's not like a water bottle. God's something different. God is this infinite thing. So he has this idea of God in his mind. What's the natural question you might ask? Well, where did that idea come from? Right? Did Descartes just make up his idea of God? Did he just imagine and produce it himself? You have an idea of a desk that you're sitting in. Did you just make that up? Where did your idea of the desk come from? Well, you might think there's something out in the world called a desk that caused me to have an idea of it. Maybe something similarly is going on here. There remains only the idea of God. He's reflected on this and he's thinking about this idea now. Concerning which we must consider whether it is something which cannot have proceeded from me myself. Did I just make this idea up? By the name God, I understand a substance that is infinite, eternal, unchanging, independent, all-knowing, all-powerful, and by which I myself and everything else, if anything else does exist, have been created. Right? This typically goes along with the idea we have of God. God is a creator. God brought all this into existence. Now, all these characteristics are such that the more diligently I attend to them, the less do they appear capable of proceeding from me alone. Hence, from what has already been said, we must conclude that God necessarily exists. For although the idea of substance is within me owing to the fact that I am a substance, nevertheless, I should not have the idea of an infinite substance, since I am finite, if it had not proceeded from substance which was truly infinite. So what is going on here? Well, we have this idea of God. Descartes is saying he has this idea of God, this infinite, all-powerful, all-knowing thing. He thinks, did I make it up? Well, no. Again, because the cause of something must be more real or as real as the effect it produces, when Descartes has this idea of infinity, he's thinking, something infinite must produce that idea within me. How else could I get the idea of infinity as a finite thing unless there was something out there in the world that was infinite that caused me to have this idea? So, fourth premise, however, humans didn't come up with or hallucinate or make up this idea of an infinite thing. Because we are not infinite. We have an idea of something that is infinite in our minds. We could not have come up with that because we are not infinite ourselves. The only thing that could have caused us to have such an idea of infinity, of something infinite, is something that has that property. Likewise, I'll start writing it over here. The only thing that could have us, that could produce within us an idea that there's this infinite thing that has those properties, it's all powerful, it's all knowing, it's all good. The only cause of that idea within our own minds could be something that's actually like that. It could only be something that's like that in the world. So consequently, because we could not have come up with this idea of an infinite, powerful, all good, all powerful, all good, all knowing thing, it must have come from God. This is Descartes' first proof for the existence of God. What do y'all think of this? Is this a good argument? Yeah, Angel.
I don't think so, because he argues that all of these properties couldn't have originated from the human mind, because
Yes.
a thing that is finite can't imagine something that's infinite, and so it must have come externally. But I feel like everything he's saying sort of hinges on the basis that we don't just extrapolate what we find in the real world. We know everything has an end, so we can imagine something that doesn't have an end. And then that becomes the idea of what's infinite. And so it's not just we can't imagine something infinite. Because he says it later that he doesn't believe it's just the negation of certain
It's
things.
just the negation of something that has a limit, right? Yeah.
It's just the negation of something that has a limit. And it's sort of just we put it, his idea of God is just all these things that we couldn't conceptualize, you put together. But really, it's if you push all these things to an extreme, all good. We know things can be good, so you just, all good. We know something can have power, but it's limited, all powerful. And all of these things are just pushing the limit of things we do know.
So you disagree, I guess, with maybe this premise. This premise 4, which is supposed to stipulate that our ideas of things could only come from things that have those properties. You're saying, well, look, why couldn't we just come up with the idea of infinity from things that are finite? Right? Yeah, Descartes tries to argue against this, but that's one way of attacking this argument. What do the rest of y'all think? Yeah.
To me, it seems not only possible that we could come up with something infinite, but it seems pretty likely that it's kind of a human idea to create a personable being that created us. That seems like just evolutionarily something that humans would do. So I think it's pretty likely that we would create something infinite in our minds.
So you're also disagreeing with this premise 4? You're thinking look, it's not only possible that we could come up with the ideas of things that don't exist, but it's actually likely because of maybe how we are psychologically, our existential condition, whatever. Maybe we came up with the idea of God because we just can't stand thinking we aren't here for a reason or purpose and it's all a cosmic accident and we want comfort and security. Maybe. Okay. Is that the only weakness in this argument, though? Is it only premise 4 that y'all disagree with? If you do disagree? Yeah.
I disagree with point number 3, the idea that God is all powerful, all good, and everything. In
Okay.
Old Testament, he kills a bunch of people, billions, and so when Descartes is trying to say oh, he's all good and all powerful, I just don't agree with that.
So your idea of God is not this kind of thing.
God is just God. I think he lacks some empathy here and there, and that humans have more empathy than God.
You think so? Okay, so yeah, you'd be like, well, look, my idea of God, Descartes, isn't the same as your idea. My idea of God is actually, maybe he's an asshole or something. Okay. Yeah, what do the rest of y'all think? Is this a good argument? Are you convinced?
Yeah, kind of related to what you were saying. It's really hard to believe that everyone is thinking of the same picture of God.
Okay.
So they just might have many different ideas of him.
That's probably true, right? A lot of people have different ideas about God. Descartes isn't basing his argument, though, on other people's ideas. He's basing it on his own. He's saying, I have this idea of an infinite, all-good, all-powerful thing. Where could that have come from? It doesn't seem like I just came up with it. It came from something actually out there in the world.
I feel like if we look at problem number 2, the cause of something must be more real, or as real as the effect it produces.
Uh-huh.
I think that, well, if there's this all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing, infinite being, what if that idea was placed into our head by the evil genius or deceiver?
Yes, that's a concern as well, right? Okay, so you actually don't disagree with this premise, but you're raising a different problem, which is, okay, yeah, how do you know this isn't just a false idea implanted in you by like a demon or something, you know? Yeah, okay. What were you going to say?
I would say that I don't think there's like a gradient of more real or as real of things.
You don't think so?
No.
Okay. Why not?
We can imagine things and they might not be presented exactly in front of us, but once like we make things happen, I'm getting lost here. Your sort of mind after you make things happen. Like I have an idea for a business, I can make it a reality, and that is real. It's not
Sure.
just a gradient.
Well, would you say the idea you have in your own mind of the desk is as real as the desk? Just want to bite the bullet and be like, yeah, they're both as real. It's just they have a different kind of existence, maybe. You know, this is like a picture, this is like a physical thing.
I sort of think our imagination, we can't equate it to whether it's real or not. It's just in our heads.
Okay, so maybe you think like talking about the reality of our ideas is already kind of off the mark.
Yeah, and I think like when he says perfect, we imagine things as perfect, as like completely flawless. But I'm pretty sure when he talks about perfect, he means it's like reality and it exists. Because he says like,
That is correct, yeah.
God can only be good. I wrote this down. God's only good, and he can only conceive things, or like he can only represent things that are good. Therefore, he can't represent anything that's not reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he's got this picture of God where, God would never deceive anybody. God doesn't change his mind. But he's thinking, because there are degrees of reality or degrees of perfection. If there's anything that has the most reality, it's got to be God. But you say you disagree with this idea that there are degrees of reality, right? So,
as well as like we didn't touch on what he was talking about with like needing God for perceptions and like knowing things outside of yourself. But he says like we can know that God. We only can be sure of our perceptions if God exists, like our clear and distinct perception of God exists.
Right.
But he also says we can only know that God exists because of our perception of him and our idea of him.
Okay, yeah, we're going to get to that in a little bit here.
That feels kind of circular.
We're going to talk about that at the end. This is a well-known problem for Descartes' philosophy. What it's important to recognize for Descartes is that his argument depends on some premises. His argument depends on the aforementioned distinctions. Okay? He thinks that there are different degrees of reality or perfection. Things in the world don't all have the same level or degree of existence. Okay? What has the maximum level of reality? Well, it would be something like an infinite substance. An infinite thing. What is that? Well, Descartes' like, that's God. God has the most reality. God has the most perfection. Let's call this medium. What kind of has like medium reality, medium perfection? Well, finite substances. Like cats. Like tables. Like doors. Like human beings. We're finite substances. Things, what you would call things or objects. What has the minimum level or degree of reality? Well, it's not going to be substances. Remember, substances don't depend on anything else for their existence. They have their own independent existence. If you died tonight, this table would still be here, right? This table does not depend on you for its existence. So things like modes. You might think of a mode as like, well, like a way of being or something. Stuff like roundness, that's a mode. Furriness. Other ideas. These things have the least degree of perfection or reality because their existence depends on something else. So this is the kind of picture Descartes is working with. But if you didn't like that first proof, why don't we go to his second proof and see what y'all think about that? Here he's just concluding again that the only way he could have this idea of God is if God put it in him, as if God caused him to have this idea. But he goes on, and I ask, from whom do I then derive my existence? From myself, or from my parents, or from some other source less perfect than God? For we can imagine nothing more perfect than God, or even as perfect as he is. But were I independent of every other, and were I myself the author of my being, if I caused myself to exist, I should doubt nothing, and I should desire nothing. And finally, no perfection would be lacking in me, would be lacking to me. For I should have bestowed on myself every perfection of which I possessed any idea, and thus I should be like God if I created myself. Like, you wouldn't create yourself less perfect or less cool, right? No, you'd create yourself as perfect, as amazing, as awesome as possible, right? And it must not be imagined that those things that are lacking to me are perhaps more difficult of attainment than those which I already possess. For on the contrary, it is quite evident that it was a matter of much greater difficulty to bring to pass that I, that is to say, a thing or a substance that thinks, should emerge out of nothing, than it would be to attain to the knowledge of many things of which I am ignorant, and which are only the accidents of this thinking substance. But it is clear that if I had of myself possessed this greater perfection of which I have just spoken, that is to say, if I had been the author of my own existence, I should not at least have denied myself the things which are the more easy to acquire, to wit, many branches of knowledge of which my nature is destitute. If he made himself, he's like, I would have made myself like really knowledgeable. Duh. Nor should I have deprived myself of any of the things contained in the idea which I form of God, because there are none of them which seem to me specially difficult to acquire. And if there were any that were more difficult to acquire, they would certainly appear to me to be such, since I should discover in them that my powers were limited. But though I assume that perhaps I have always existed just as I am at present, neither can I escape the force of this reasoning, and imagine that conclusion to be drawn from this, that I need not seek for any author of my existence. For all the course of my life may be divided into an infinite number of parts, none of which is in any way dependent on the other. And thus, from the fact that I was in existence a short time ago, it does not follow that I must be in existence now, unless some cause at this instant is sustaining me, is conserving me. It is, as a matter of fact, perfectly clear and evident to all those who consider with attention the nature of time, that in order to be conserved in each moment in which a thing endures, a substance has need of the same power and action as would be necessary to produce and create it anew, supposing it did not exist. So that the light of nature shows us clearly that the distinction between creation and conservation of a thing is solely a distinction of the reason. All that I thus require here is that I should interrogate myself if I wish to know whether I possess a power which is capable of sustaining myself. For since I am nothing but a thinking thing, or at least since thus far it is only this portion of myself which is precisely in question, if such a power did reside in me, I should certainly be conscious of it. But I am conscious of nothing of the kind, and by this I clearly know that I depend on some being different from myself for my own existence. Perhaps, then, I am created either by my parents or some other cause less perfect than God. But this cannot be, because, as I have just said, it is perfectly evident that there must be as much reality in the cause as in its effect, and thus, since I am a thinking thing and possess an idea of God within me, whatever is the cause of my existence, it must be allowed that it is likewise a thinking thing, and that it possesses in itself the same idea of all the perfections which I attribute to God. From this, it follows, by reasons before brought forward, that this cause must itself be God. For since it possesses the virtue of self-existence, it must also, without doubt, have the power of actually possessing all the perfections of which it has the idea. That is, all of those which I conceive as existing in God. Okay, so did you catch the proof? What's his second argument for the existence of God? Did Descartes just create himself? Is he sustaining himself? Is he keeping himself alive? Well, he would say ultimately no. Okay? Premise 1, the same power is needed to create something and sustain it. Premise 2. As a thinking thing, Descartes says, I do not have the power to create or sustain myself. Otherwise, I would know of it. And he's like, I'm not conscious of having any power like that. Sustain myself. Premise 3. Since I am a thinking thing, what created me must also be a thinking thing and have the same ideas regarding the perfections and existence of God. Why does he believe this? Since I am a thinking thing, I, Descartes, am a thinking thing, my creator must have also been a thinking thing.
Because you can create an idea without a cause. You can't think of something new.
Yeah, everything has to have a cause. And don't forget, however much reality an effect has, the cause of that effect must be as real or more real. So whatever caused Descartes to exist, he thinks, well, it's got to be at least as real or more real than me. I'm a thinking thing, so the cause must have this property as well. It must be at least as real as me. Descartes' like, my parents don't have the power to create or sustain me. It's not as if my parents are hanging out right next to me and they're like giving me their power and sustaining my life force. No. So what? Well, it must be God who created and is sustaining me. The only thing that could be creating and sustaining me is God. What do you think? Good argument, bad argument?
Well, it's not a critical argument. Is using sustain as like keeping like real?
Keeping him real and alive.
Okay.
He's got this idea that like, look, in order for something for its existence to be maintained, like something must be keeping it in existence. Maybe that's like a hidden premise here that you might disagree with. Do you think in order for this desk to exist, something needs to be maintaining its existence?
I feel like what he's trying to say is like the same power needed to create you is needed every second in which you exist. Because I guess the way he thinks about it is like you're made of sand and every second you fall apart and it's got to be put back together.
That's not a bad picture.
And unless something has the power to put you back together every second you exist, you don't. But that comes from like some idea about causes. Like causes can only create a photo and then something has to like, hold that photo together until it undoes itself. And that like, I don't know, that things that are created just unwind because they're just the sum of their parts.
I mean, scientists kind of believe that, right?
Yeah.
We live in an entropic universe where everything is on its way to disrepair, disharmony. So maybe there's a germ of truth in kind of what Descartes is thinking about here. Maybe? What do you think? Good or bad argument? Use your critical thinking skills. Yeah.
I think maybe he doesn't know the answer to this, so he's just placing God into that thing. Like, I think it's okay if they don't know. I don't think, like, it's kind of the God of the gaps. Like, you don't know something, so you just conclude to it's God.
Yeah, so maybe you're thinking, yeah, this is just a God of the gaps thing. You know, he doesn't actually know what created and is sustaining him, so he's just like, it has to be God. And you might think, is that logical? Like, do we need to make that leap? You know?
Well, what you just said about the complex universe, isn't it kind of like against the idea of God? Because if God is like infinite, why would the universe eventually end?
It's a good question. Maybe something about the nature of reality is such. For example, you might agree with Leibniz, who thinks, of all the worlds and universes God created, we are in the best possible one. There is no greater universe and world that we live in that God could have created. This is the best one. Now, some people might say that's silly because it's like, look at all the evil, right? Look at all the suffering. This is the best world? What are you talking about? But then, some people who believe in God would fire back with, well, the reason we're in this mess in the first place isn't God's fault. Humans way back when fucked up. And now we got to deal with their shit. But one more comment. What do you think of this argument? If you don't like it, which premise do you disagree with?
I think he takes a jump from 2 to 3. I think like number 3 sort of rides on his first proof of saying like reality. My cause must be more real than me, or a cause must be more real.
Right,
He
yeah.
doesn't really address that in this at all.
Yeah, this one is based on that idea of reality of cause and effect, yeah. And if you disagree with that, right, you might think, this doesn't follow then. Why does my creator have to be a thinking thing? So many people believe it doesn't, right? Our existence is just, a weird cosmic accident of biochemical reactions in, the sea that adapted and evolved over time or something. Yeah. Yeah. So at least this premise depends on one of the earlier claims that he's made. And if you disagree with that, you might not think this is a good argument. Now, Descartes does respond to a few objections for this argument, but I'm not going to go through them right now. There are a few things that we need to get through, and that is in Meditation 4. What Descartes is discussing in this meditation is basically the possibility of error. Because look, he's concluded that God exists, that God is sustaining him, that God is preserving him. But if God is all good and all powerful, how is it possible that we can fall into error? Like if God was all good, wouldn't he make it so that our ideas of things aren't wrong? So that our senses, are reliable? Wouldn't God make it so if he actually loved us and he's not a deceiver? That is the general theme of this meditation. Now, he also expresses a few other main points of his philosophy. One of them being the existence of innate ideas. See, Descartes does not think that we get all of our ideas from things in the world. Rather, he thinks we are born pre-programmed with certain ideas in our minds, like the idea of God. And this is what he talks about in this passage. This idea I have of God, I did not receive it through the senses, but it is presented to me unexpectedly. Like I didn't get it through my eyes. It's not a fiction of my mind because it's not my power to take anything or add anything to it. Consequently, the only alternative is that it is innate in me just as the idea of myself is innate within me. So we come born pre-programmed, you might say, with certain ideas or concepts of reality. God, of course, he thinks is the cause of our idea of him, but he didn't show us himself and then we formed the idea of God. No, God pre-programmed us with the idea of him.
I feel like that idea is kind of ridiculous because it can only be stated by someone who lives in a world that doesn't have religion and wasn't taught religion as they grew up. Like he grew up in a Catholic world and they told him God existed. And then he turns around and says, where did this idea of God come from? The thin air. Like, he was raised in a world that had a religion and that was taught to him, and that's just what he continued to believe.
Yeah, you might think we get our ideas rather from upbringing and from environment and from experience. John Locke had this view. Okay? He had the view of human nature that we are blank slates, tabula rasa. We don't come pre-programmed with any ideas or concepts. No, we learn what the world is like. We get our ideas from experience, from our environment, from our parents, our upbringing, etc. Nevertheless, Descartes believes in innate ideas. Okay? What else does he believe in? Well, as we've already seen, God exists. Our existence depends on God. God is not a deceiver. Okay? God is all good. And in this meditation, he concludes, God has given us a functioning mind in order to apprehend the truth. So after he has proved that God exists, what does he do? Well, he turns to, if God created me and God exists and God made me this way, what else can I know? What else can I take to the bank? What else can I deduce from this? Well, he thinks about it and he realizes we can still fall into error. Even though God has given us a good working mind, we can still fall into error. And this is actually our fault. It's not a fault with our reasoning faculty. God didn't give us a defective mind. Rather, we misuse it, and that's why we fall into error. It's not God's fault that we believe dumb things or we come to the wrong conclusions. It's because we overestimate ourselves, or our will gets ahead of us and we want to believe something and we don't rein it in. So he says, look, the proper thing to do, if you don't know something clearly and distinctly, if you don't have certainty, suspend your judgment. He's like, this is just a good practice to engage in when you're thinking about this stuff. But now one final thing. This is important. We already saw that there is an objection to Descartes' philosophy. Why did he bother proving the existence of God? Well, it was because, look, if he didn't prove the existence of an all-good God, he still has to worry that maybe there's nothing he knows because, again, there might be an all-powerful evil demon. So he had to prove the existence of God to justify the possibility of knowledge. This is known as the Cartesian circle that some people accuse Descartes of engaging in. He says, I can know whatever I perceive clearly and distinctly is true if and only if God exists and is not a deceiver. If and only if but what does his belief in the existence of God depend on? Clear and distinct ideas. He basically argues, I can know God exists and is not a deceiver. He's all good. If and only if I'm having distinct ideas. Clear and distinct ideas. You might think, look, he came to believe that God exists on the basis of clear and distinct ideas, but, well, it seems we have to presume that God exists and is not a deceiver in order for us to trust we have clear and distinct ideas. Otherwise, all our ideas, right, could just be fictions of the evil demon leading us astray. This is known as the Cartesian circle. And this is something that you should do well to reflect on. Try to see if Descartes actually falls victim to this. There are many Descartes scholars who think, no, actually, he has a way out of this that he expresses in these meditations. All right. Thank you very much. Continue to read. We'll look at Meditations 5 and 6 on Thursday. We have our in-class essay on Tuesday, a week from today. So buy a blue book, bring a pen and a pencil. Do you need the sheet? You need this?